So when I left off, we talked about protists and we talked about fungi. Protists, at least, you've got a pretty good chance of getting to see in lab next week, which is the one where we show you how to use a light microscope. And just as a recap, for our purposes, there's 4 kingdoms of eukaryotes: animals, plants, and fungi, plus a 4th that really doesn't count as a kingdom, and the pros divided up in various ways that don't really need to concern us here, called the protista. The first 3 are mostly multicellular. There's a few exceptions like yeast among the fungi, and most show some degree of cell differentiation. Different cell types are specialized to do different things. So let's look at the plants. Almost all plants, with a few exceptions, are photosynthetic, and they use a compound called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is able to do this really neat chemical trick where it picks up energy from sunlight and is able to use that energy to drive the plant's, ultimately to drive the plant's metabolism. And chlorophyll, by the way, looks green. This is why leaves look green. There are a few plants that aren't green because they are parasitic, and I'll show you one in a bit. Parasitic means that they don't make their own food. They live on other plants and basically take the energy and nutrients that those plants make and use them for themselves. Plant cells are surrounded by cell walls. Now, we mentioned bacterial cell walls are made at least partly of stuff called peptidoglycan. The cell walls of fungi are made of chitin. Plant cell walls are made of a substance called cellulose. And you know cellulose very well because it's basically dietary fiber, and it's what is used to make paper. Wood is mostly cellulose. You're very familiar with this substance. In many plants, the plant itself may be alive, but many functioning plant cells may be dead. The cell itself may die, and the cell wall may be all that remains. I'll show you pictures of that coming up. Cells on the outside of a plant, by the way, are also surrounded by a wax layer called a cuticle, which reduces water loss from the plant. What are some good examples? Yeah, if you take like a magnolia leaf and scrape it with your fingernail, you can actually scrape up some waxy flakes of the cuticle. And there's a few plants, like a plant called bayberry, a plant called Chinese tallow, where the leaves or the fruits produce so much wax on the outside that can actually be harvested and used to make candles. You might have seen bayberry candles in a, I don't know, gift shop or something like that. That's where that comes from, that outer waxy layer on a plant. What you're looking at is a cross section through a leaf, highly magnified. And what I want you to see here, we don't need to worry about what all of these different cell types are called. But up on the top, you've got kind of squarish cells. That's the upper surface of the leaf. Down here below, you've got the lower surface of the leaf, these cells that look like blocks. There, I'll give you another one of those uppers. Below that upper layer, you have cells that are very elongated. If you must know, it's called columnar palisade mesophyll. There you've got another layer of slightly shorter cells that are still column-shaped. Below that, we've got a layer of cells that are kind of irregular. They kind of bend around a lot, and they've got open spaces through them. Over here, we've got cells in pairs. Those are actually protect openings into the leaf so the leaf can take in atmospheric gases. So, and then here we've got special water conducting cells in the middle. And again, we don't really need to worry about what these are, but I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different cell types just in one field of view. And that's what I mean by cell differentiation. Different types of cell arranged in patterns and functioning to do different things. Most plants are photosynthetic, but a few aren't. And this is one that I have actually seen in some of the cow pastures around where I live. I live in a slightly rural area that's somewhere in the strange, misty borderlands between Conway and Valonia. And driving into work, I drive past this pasture that had some bushes in it. And now and again, I'd see this. The golden yellow tangly stuff that looks like somebody dumped a plate of spaghetti out is actually a non-photosynthetic plant called dodder. Dodder grows as this long tangle of stems. It doesn't have leaves of its own. It's not green. It doesn't do photosynthesis. What it does is penetrate into green plants and rob nutrients directly from them. It may even kill the host plant. So that's a parasitic plant, one that's an exception to the rule that plants are photosynthetic, and one that you can see around here now and again if you know what you're looking for. But the vast majority of plants are photosynthetic. They are, this is a word we used on Wednesday, autotrophs. Troph meaning to feed, and auto meaning self. They are self-feeders. Plants are able to take very small molecules, water, carbon dioxide gas, that's a carbon atom stuck to 2 oxygens, CO2, and some nutrients taken from the soil, like nitrogen and a few other minerals, put them together and make more complicated molecules. And they're able to drive that whole process using captured solar energy through this beautiful piece of chemistry called photosynthesis that I just don't have time to get into in much detail. To carry this out, plants use a green substance called chlorophyll. If you want to get technical, they use a mixture of 2 slightly different types of chlorophyll, but we're not going to worry about that. In this diagram that you're seeing, please do not make any attempt to memorize it. The details for our purposes now don't matter. Something that we will see again is that when chemists draw formulas of complicated molecules, carbon is so common that they often don't bother to write it. So everywhere you see an angle with 2 or 3 lines meeting, there's an atom of carbon right there. I'm drawing in a few of them represented by the letter C, but I'm certainly not going to draw them in all. Every one of these angles represents a carbon atom. There are also some hydrogen atoms that are not even shown because chemists can figure out where they are using some basic rules of chemistry. Some of you might know them. Some of you might be very familiar with them. Some of you might not. So I'm just making sure we're all on the same page. Anyway, chlorophyll is this very complex, multiple ring-shaped molecule with a long tail. And all we need to know about it here is that that's the pigment that absorbs light energy and converts it into energy that can drive chemical reactions. That chemical energy that chlorophyll creates is used to convert carbon dioxide gas and water into a simple sugar called glucose. Glucose is certainly present in food. It doesn't taste quite as sweet as table sugar, which is called sucrose. Glucose can be used to build more complicated sugars, like sucrose or like fructose. Fructose is found in fruit, and it's found in HFCS, high fructose corn sweetener, which is what you get in, well, an awful lot of your diet these days. Glucose can be used to build other molecules like cellulose. Glucose can also be broken down and release energy for yet other types of chemical reactions that the plant needs to carry out. What you're looking at here, by the way, is a close-up of a sugar maple tree, probably up in Vermont or something like that. What they do is somebody's driven a metal tube right into the maple tree. It's called a spile, and hung a collecting vessel underneath that tube. And what's dripping out is the sap of the maple tree. You can just see one little droplet of maple sap, which is rich in glucose and in other sugars that were made and stored by this plant. Of course, the maple sap, once it's collected, is taken and boiled down to make maple syrup. Real maple syrup is very good, much, much better than the artificial Mrs. Butterworth stuff. Everybody should try it if you ever get the chance. Right. So that's just an example of sugars being produced, and in this case, being harvested by a plant. Sugars that are made from simple molecules using chemical energy that's ultimately derived from sunlight. Now, many plants contain other pigments as well. Certainly, flowers are not usually green. They've got, many other colors. Some plants have, red or yellow leaves. And of course, in the fall, especially up in places like the Ozarks, the leaves of many plants lose their green and turn red or yellow or orange. Pigments like xanthophyll, which is yellow, carotenoid pigments are orange. Anthocyanins are red and blue. Anthocyanins are responsible for everything from the color of roses and violets to the color of blueberries and beets and blueberries and beets and other colorful vegetables like that. In the case of leaves in the fall, those pigments are always present, but when fall hits and cold weather hits and the plant prepares to drop its leaves, the chlorophyll breaks down, and that shows these red and orange xanthophylls and carotenoids that were present all the time. You just couldn't see them because the chlorophyll was covering them up. So now you know why leaves turn color in the fall. There's some plant cells under the light microscope. This is actually the same water plants that you're going to look at in lab this coming Tuesday or Thursday, lab 2, unless, of course, we get hit by a giant meteorite or something like that, which after 2 years, I don't think I can rule that out. Each one of these things that looks like boxes is a cell. Each one of these green spots is an organelle that is where photosynthesis actually happens. It's an organelle called a chloroplast, and you'll see them. There is a nucleus in here, although without staining, it's hard to pick out, but I promise you it's there. And surrounding the whole thing is not just a cell membrane, but a cell wall, Remember that fungi have cell walls made out of chitin. Plants have cell walls made out of cellulose. If you wanted to make a model of a plant cell, you could always take a water balloon and stuff it in a shoebox. The shoebox would be the cell wall, and then the water balloon with its contents would be the cell membrane, and then the liquid part of the cell inside. In many plants, there's a second substance, not just cellulose, but a substance called lignin. Lignin, by the way, comes from the Latin word for wood, and lignin links cellulose molecules together into an extremely tough network. Wood is, of course, derived from plants because trees are plants, duh. And what makes wood woody is not just the cellulose in those cell walls, but the lignin in it as well, that makes the cellulose a lot tougher. Softer plant parts like flower petals or leaves of spinach or other edible leaves, those softer parts have little or no lignin in them, and the cell walls are fairly flexible. That's why flower petals can be soft and delicate. This happens to be a slice through the root of a buttercup, and it's been stained with a dye. The cells that contain lignin have been stained to appear pink. So in the center of this buttercup root, you have a big bundle of lignified cells that are looking pink right here, surrounded by bundles of cells that are not lignified, whose cell walls are stained a rather psychedelic blue-green. Okay, by the way, since you're looking at a cross-section, what you're seeing is those pink cells making that cross in the center that don't seem to have anything inside them. I'll show you more pictures of this in a bit, but those are water-conducting cells. They're of a type called xylem, and I'll show you that word in a bit. And they're shaped like pipes, and they carry water, in this case, from the ground through the roots, ultimately up to the stem and leaves and all the rest of the plant. And you have this big bundle of xylem. They're shaped like pipes, and you're looking at them end on. So imagine you've got a whole pile of pipes, and you're standing and you're looking down each one. You'd see a whole bunch of circles, but if we could see this from the side, you'd see that these are actually long pipes. That's what you're looking at here, a cross-shaped bundle of pipe-shaped cells that the plant uses for water transport. Okay, in many plant tissues, when they're mature, believe it or not, the plant cell itself dies and leaves behind these dead cell walls. This picture that you're looking at, taken with a gizmo called a scanning electron microscope, is a picture of a slice of cork. You know, the stuff that you would find in wine, stopping up wine bottles. The stuff that's used to make cork boards. You all know what cork is, I trust. Natural cork is actually harvested from a tree, grows in Spain. It's called the cork bark oak, and it's an oak tree. And the bark just happens to, right under the surface, the bark has this very thick layer of cork. And people come and peel the bark right off this tree, and then take the inner layer of this bark, which is very thick, and use it to make wine corks and things like that out of. So natural cork is a part of a tree. It surrounds the outside of the tree, and when it's mature, the cells actually die, and they leave behind these empty cell walls. This is why cork floats. It's so full of these empty spaces that in dried cork just fill up with air. This is why cork is, yeah, it's why cork floats. And incidentally, removing the cork layer from a cork bark oak tree doesn't actually hurt the tree because the cork is already dead and the tree is able to grow more. So you can peel the cork layer off of a cork bark oak once every, I can't remember, but once every couple of years. You can keep harvesting cork from the same tree. You know, it's a little bit like a loose analogy would be the cells that make up the outermost layer of your skin. Those are dead and they protect you and they keep you from losing water, but they're dead when they're functional and they're constantly flaking off and new cells are constantly being born to replace them. And the old cells are constantly flaking off. When it happens on your scalp, that's called dandruff. When that happens on your elbows, that's called being ashy. That's the stuff you have to, you know, clean off with lotions and, you know, scrubbing pads and things like that. It's the same deal in this plant. The outer layer of the bark is dead when it's functional and can be peeled off without hurting the tree. And all it is it's made up of cell walls. This happens to be a slice through a plant stem. And at the very tip of a plant stem, you have a bud. What you're looking at here is baby leaves. And they are wrapped up very tightly around a little cluster of cells right here at the tip of the stem called an apical meristem. That's the only place where the cell walls are very weak and they're still stretchable and cells are actively dividing. The cells that are down here, lower down in the stem, they might be able to stretch a little bit, but they're not growing, they're not dividing. They're just going to sit there, and many of them are ultimately going to die. And this is okay. This is the way the plant grows. That outer bark layer is dead, so is wood. In a typical tree, there's only one thin layer of living cells in the trunk. The wood cells on the inside die, and the bark cells on the outside die. And the only living tissue is the stuff in between. And that's how the tree is able to survive. So the cells down in here may not even live. They certainly don't grow. The only place where active growth is taking place is up here at the very tip in a zone called the apical meristem. By the way, there are also little clusters of immature cells that can still divide over here on the sides, like this one that I have just circled. And if you happen to cut off the tip of a stem, then the little clusters of cells on the sides will start growing and they'll put out side branches. This is the point of pruning. If you've ever seen the landscapers on campus taking, you know, going up to one of our bushes with shears and pruning them, cutting off the tips, this not only shapes the plant and keeps it a manageable size, but when you cut off the tips of the shoots right there, the side branches all sprout out. And if you keep doing that, it makes the plant very branched and very bushy. It makes for a bushier, fuller looking plant than if you just let it grow naturally. And it all comes from the fact that plants, most plants, grow only from the tips. Right? A tree can't get better. A tree doesn't get taller by making the base of its trunk longer. A tree can't stretch up from below. A tree can only grow at the very tips of the branches. I'm not going to go much into different types of plants that we have. For our purposes, we can divide plants into two major types. A group we call bryophytes. Bryon happens to be Greek for a moss. And bryophytes include true mosses and a few relatives of theirs like liverworts and hornworts. Don't worry about them, though you'll see some nice ones if you hike that trail down to the waterfalls up at Pettigene. Anyway, bryophytes don't have specialized tissues for transporting water. Bryophytes tend to be small. They tend to grow only in moist areas. There are some mosses that can grow in deserts, but they're actually able to go into suspended animation whenever it gets dry, which is actually, pretty much most of the time. And the reason for this is that they're not able to transport water from the ground to other parts of the plant. Every one of those plant cells needs water. It can't dry out completely. But since mosses don't have a way of transporting water from one part of the plant to the other, the entire plant has to be kept damp. And this is why you tend to find mosses in places that stay pretty damp, like on the soil, in shady spots around the roots of trees and places like that, sometimes growing directly on trees, places that tend to get a lot of moisture and tend to trap it. So this is why we don't get mosses growing the size of live oaks. They are, as we say, non-vascular plants. Vascular, by the way, means having to do with vessels, and it doesn't just apply to plants. A vascular surgeon, for example, is a surgeon who specializes in operating on blood vessels. You might go to a vascular surgeon to take care of your varicose veins or something like that. Not you personally, but someone would. Vascular means having to do with vessels. So bryophytes are non-vascular. Virtually all the plants that you're familiar with, everything from ferns to oak trees to roses and daisies to pansies and violets, virtually all the plants that you would know are in a much larger group called the tracheophytes. And tracheo ought to make you think of your trachea, the tube that carries air from your throat down into your chest. Trachea is another word for a tube or a vessel. And tracheophytes are what we call vascular plants because they have specialized cells that transport water and carry nutrients as well throughout the plant. So water can get from the ground all the way up to the leaves of this tree where it's needed. And the sugars that are made by photosynthesis can be transported from the leaves to the roots where they're needed. So plants can transport water and nutrients to all parts. What you're looking at here is a magnified slice through the stem of, this happens to be alfalfa. And each one of these circular areas that you're seeing is a cell. Some of these cells are just kind of placeholders, but stained here in pink, what you're looking at here is a cross-sectional view through one type of vascular tissue that transports water. This is called the xylem. And then next to the xylem, we've got a bundle of specialized cells that transport nutrients. They're called phloem. So xylem refers to the tissue that transports water, usually from the roots up. Xylo or xylate, by the way, is Greek for wood. You might have heard of a xylophone. That's an instrument where you make sound by hitting bars of wood. So xylophone means wood sound in Greek. So xylem is the tissue that transports water. And yeah, the wood of a tree, by the way, is almost entirely made of xylem. And then transporting nutrients from the leaves down, we've got different types of cells that make up the phloem. On a tree, I'm looking at one through my window. If you think about a tree, most of that tree is xylem. That's the wood. The phloem is contained in the inner bark. And then outside the inner bark, there's an outer bark layer, and that includes the bark that you actually see and the bark of the cork bark oak. So that's where all that comes from. In this alfalfa, in that stem, you've got a bundle of xylem next to a bundle of phloem, and you've got several of these bundles in the stem. Next time you eat a piece of celery, celery is basically very long leaf stems. And if you've ever noticed, when you bite celery, you get these little strings that sometimes get caught between your teeth. You get these strands. Each one of those strands is a bundle of xylem cells joined with a bundle of phloem cells. That's how the celery plant would get water from the roots up to the leaves and nutrients from the leaves down to the roots. That's all I'm going to say about plants. There is an immense amount more that we could say, but time is fleeting, and we've only got 2 weeks until the first exam comes. I've got to keep us on a fairly tight schedule. So let's look at that last kingdom, the kingdom Animalia. When I say the word animal, probably everybody thinks of something like this. This absolutely adorable, warm, furry, cuddly creature that would eat you if it ever got the chance. This is a snow leopard. And of course, this is an animal. And if I say animal, most of you are likely to think of dogs or cats or bears or sheep or goats or snow leopards or pandas or something like that. But this is also an animal. This is an insect, of course. This is the common white-tailed dragonfly, which you see a lot of around here in the spring, by the way, Libellula lydia. And it's just a reminder that when I say the word animal, what most of you probably think of is mammals. Animals with a backbone and hair and warm body temperature and feed their babies with milk. And these are the ones we tend to bond with the most. So dogs and cats and livestock animals are mammals. But the vast majority of animals are not mammals. The largest phylum, remember a phylum is what kingdoms are divided into. The largest phylum is called the phylum Arthropoda, and that includes insects. There's nearly 1 million known species of insects, everything from dragonflies to cockroaches to honeybees. Other arthropods that are not insect include spiders and scorpions and ticks and crabs and lobsters and shrimp and tailless whip scorpions and many, many other types. So most animals don't have hair, don't look especially adorable, don't feed their babies with milk, and aren't especially cuddly. Even this is an animal. We actually used to have someone here at UCA that studied these a bit. You would find these critters living in his case, he found them in fairly shallow, muddy bottom channels in the ocean just off the coast of Washington State. He would go up to Puget Sound in Western Washington to go find these. The thing looks kind of like a feather sticking up out of the ocean floor. They get up to maybe a foot long. It is fleshy. It'll contract if you poke it, and it glows in the dark. Like, what the heck is this thing? Why is this thing an animal? It doesn't look like anything you're likely to have seen before. Good old Panatula phosphorea, aka the sea pen. What makes things as different as a snow leopard and a sea pen animals is that, first of all, they're made of many cells, they're multicellular, and cells are specialized to do different things. That sea pen might have 10 different cell types. You have roughly 200. That sea pen might be made of several million cells. You're made up of 37 trillion estimated. Animals are generally heterotrophic, meaning that to get both energy and the molecules that they need to build their own bodies, the molecules that they need to run their metabolism, they have to eat other living things. So yeah, most animals eat. They're heterotrophs. Most animals are motile, which just means they're able to move at least some stage of their life cycle. Animals like corals and sponges generally can't move as adults, but they do have larval stages that do in fact move quite a bit. So most animals are motile for at least part of their life cycle. Most animal bodies have symmetry, which just means that there's at least one way that the body of an animal can be divided into mirror image halves. I would never actually do this, but if a crazed ninja warrior jumped into the classroom and whipped out a great big sword and brought it down on the crown of your head and sliced you right down the middle, your body would be divided into two halves that were equal size and the same shape, except one's a mirror image of the other. That means you have what we call bilateral symmetry. You've got a right half and a left half, and the two halves are virtually identical in size and shape, except that one's a mirror image of the other, or close enough to a mirror image that it doesn't make any difference here. Animals don't have cell walls at all, but the cells are locked together by a network of protein fibers, and we call that network the extracellular matrix. And then all but the very simplest organisms have their cells held together both by special structures in the cells and also held together by the extracellular matrix to make these coordinated groupings, often but not always shaped like sheets, called tissues. And tissues are specialized for one particular function. We'll talk about the major types of tissue. If not today, then we'll pick it up on Monday. So here's a picture. This is a piece of human connective tissue. This is actually the loose tissue that you might find, let's say, under the skin of your cheeks. Each one of these dots that I'm circling in red right there, that's the nucleus of an actual cell. This, by the way, is a little blood vessel that got caught up. So that branching structure right there, that's a little capillary with some blood cells trapped inside. And so surrounding that blood vessel, we've got lots of cells. Every one of these little black dots is a cell. But what's locking all of these cells together is this stuff that looks kind of like dark blue cotton candy, or cotton wool, cotton fibers. And all of that stringy, floofy blue stuff is mostly a protein called collagen. And collagen and various other proteins make up what we call the extracellular matrix. That's what's holding our cells together. Our cells don't have cell walls. And it's the extracellular matrix that links all of our cells together and keeps us from turning into a cellular soup. Blood just happens to have an extracellular matrix that's a liquid. The liquid part of blood is called blood plasma. What you're looking at here is a microscopic view of a stained smear of blood. Each one of these more or less round things with a light center is a red blood cell. Those carry oxygen. And then this thing over here off to the left that has what looks like a pink clover inside it, that's a white blood cell, and those are involved in the body's immune system. They help you fight off infections. Incidentally, the white blood cell only has one nucleus. It's just that the nuclei of many types of white blood cell look kind of blobby. Many white blood cells that you'll see have these nuclei that look kind of like 3 or 4 blobs kind of stuck together, but it's still just one nucleus. By the way, in mammals, the red blood cells don't actually contain nuclei, but that doesn't mean you're a prokaryote. The red blood cells were produced from special cells in places like your bone marrow and your spleen, and those cells do contain nuclei. So they don't have nuclei when they're mature, but they come from progenitor cells that do have nuclei. So they still count as eukaryotes because they come from cells with nuclei. Just to clear that up. And okay, I tell you what, I do want to go through this, but I do want to give it just a little more time than we've got, and I've got 10:48. So by the power vested in me by the state of Arkansas, that's a decent amount to absorb for one day. We will pick this up on Monday, and I will go ahead and stop the recording.